Good morning, pre-calculus kids. Okay, we are going to jump into lesson 1-7, which is probably the biggest lesson in chapter 1. Lots of talk about domain, so I need for you to pay very close attention to all the domain issues or things we're going to discuss. So in these first few problems, the only thing we're asked to do is find the domain. Now, number one, if you look at this graph is a line. And I mean, they didn't ask you to graph the line, but certainly graphing the line will give you an idea that it goes to the left forever and to the right forever. So the domain of any line, well, I guess except for a vertical line, the domain of almost every line is negative infinity to infinity. All right, so number 2 is not going to be a line, and there is going to be a value of x which spells trouble. Like, what happens if x is 5? If x is 5, I get 10 on the top, but I get 0 on the bottom, and 10 divided by 0 is undefined. So x cannot be 5. And so that means the domain is negative infinity to 5, union with 5 to infinity. Again, be careful with MyMathLab. Sometimes they want a comma, sometimes they want the union symbol. So there are a couple of domain restrictions we're going to talk about in this lesson. And the first one we're going to encounter is anytime you put a variable in the denominator of a fraction, there is a chance you're dividing by 0. So anytime there is an x on the bottom, we are going to be restricting the domain. All right. Now, number 3, if you think about what the graph is, this is a quadratic. And so it's going to be a parabola. That's not the prettiest parabola in the world, but it's going to be a parabola. And so the domain of any parabola is negative infinity to infinity. All right. Now, number 4, we have a variable on bottom here, and we have a variable on bottom here. So there are 2 values of x that would spell trouble. So x cannot be negative 3/2, x cannot be 5. So that means it can be anything other than negative 1.5 and 5. So, here's negative 1.5. And here's 5. It can't be that. It can't be that. But it can be anything to the left of negative 1.5. It can be anything in between, and it can be anything to the right. So the way we say that in domain interval notation is negative infinity to negative 3/2, union with negative 3/2 to 5, union with 5 to infinity. Again, sometimes MyMathLab wants commas and not union symbols. Okay, so that's domain restriction number 1, is anytime you put a variable in the denominator, you can't divide by 0. So here comes domain restriction number 2. Anytime you put a variable inside a square root. Well, what kind of number can you not have inside a square root? You can't have a negative number. So that means that 7x minus 70, since it's under the radical, it has to be greater than or equal to 0. So 7x greater than or equal to 70, so x has got to be greater than or equal to 10. So the domain is 10 to infinity. 10 does have a bracket because if x is 10, you end up with 0 inside a radical, and that's allowed. You are allowed to have a 0 inside a radical. So 10 has a bracket. All right, now this one, I love this one. This one merges some algebra 1, okay, with this. So this radical, x minus 3, has to be greater than or equal to 0. So x has to be greater than 3. And x plus 4 also has to be greater than or equal to 0. So x has to be greater than or equal to negative 4. So x has to be greater than, or I'll put negative 4. X has to be greater than or equal to negative 4, and x has to be greater than 3. So what values of x would work for both of them would be the values that are just past 3. So the domain would be 3 to infinity. Okay, oh, I love this one. What happens when you put a square root on the bottom? Okay, well, normally we would say what's inside the square root is greater than or equal to 0. But since this is on the bottom, it can't equal 0, so we're just going to say greater than 0. So we're going to minus my 3, negative x greater than negative 3, and divide, and we get x less than 3. So the domain is negative infinity to 3 with a parentheses. So why is there a parentheses? There's a parentheses because it's in the bottom. You can't have 0 in the bottom. All right, another blast from the Algebra 1 past is how to factor 4 terms by grouping. So we're going to pull out an x squared and get x minus 2, pull out a negative 9 and get x minus 2, pull out the x minus 2 and get x squared minus 9. And x squared minus 9 goes further into x plus 3 and x minus 3. So that means that x can't be 2, x can't be negative 3, and x can't be 3. So if you think about a number line, can't be negative 3, can't be 2, and it can't be 3. So sorry, but this one is really long in interval notation. And I made a number line on purpose so you could see how many intervals there are. It could be this interval, it could be this interval, it could be this interval, it could be that. It just can't be negative 3, can't be 2, can't be 3. So the interval notation answer is negative infinity to negative 3, union with negative 3 to 2, union with 2 to 3, union with 3 to infinity. That's video number 1.